Hi everybody, I've seen a lot of questions about training with pells when you're at home practicing, especially with rapiers in either SCA or HEMA historical martial arts environments. And there isn't a lot of great solutions out there for what is a good rapier training pell. Ideally, you'd want something with an arm that can hold a sword so that you can practice against a sword. But most of the ones that are available out there are really based in modern fencing and don't necessarily hold up exactly right for a rapier use. So if you've got some ideas or you know some producers, please feel free to share the links in the comments section so that people can have access to those. But most of us are dealing with kind of this very sort of static target Pell structure when we practice our rapier. And one of the things that we forget to practice when we're utilizing a target like this is angulation and deflection against the weapon when we're training our attacks. So if you've gotten some beginner instruction, you know to use your Pell for distance training and to practice your attacks at different distances, whether it's the extension of the arm or the extension of the arm in the body with like a lean, or if you're doing a full lunge where you're extending the body and the arm and then the foot and you're making a full extended lunge, and maybe you've even been taught to reach at different targets where the head, the chest, or sort of the belly or leg area, and you can practice all three of those actions against your static Pell, practicing your different distances and your different targets. This creates a wide variety of actions that we can practice. But what most of us end up practicing is kind of this middle guard position, or terzas, the Italians might call it third position, Spaniards might call it fingernails in. A lot of different ways to describe this position, but it's this vertical blade position which maximizes our range, and that's really good. But what it doesn't do is provide a lot of defense against an actual opponent who might be interested in counterattacking you when you're attacking them. And so what this habit can get into is that you might get some accuracy and practice hitting those various targets, but when you get into actual combat against an opponent, you're going to be putting yourself in a situation where if you're not binding their blade or you're not attacking their blade, you're going to be open to a counterattack and probably run into a lot of doubles at best. So what this position is really good for, aside from maximizing our range, is also good for leveraging against a sword that is sort of set obliquely in front of us. So if you come against an opponent and they've turned their sword either obliquely in front of them, or you've managed to get an angle against their sword by means of stepping to the side or one another option like that, now you have the opportunity to use this hand position to leverage their sword and attack them while defending and deflecting their sword at the same time. But if you come into this engagement and they have their sword in pretty much any other position or pointed straight at you, it's going to be very difficult for you to engage with them and attack them safely without being vulnerable to their sword. You then have to rely on your offhand for a defense or some other method of hitting them without them counterattacking you, whether they're just being kind of silly and standing still and not responding, they're mentally not engaged, or whatever it is. You're kind of running into the luck of the draw if they attack you or not, and you don't really have a defense against it. So what we can do in this situation is we want to practice engaging with our angular parry motions with our sword. And in those instances, now we can drive our weapon against our opponent moving forwards into an attack. So for instance, if I've engaged my opponent on the inside of my blade and I make this angular position the Italians call fourth or fingernails up, like the Spaniards, or however I want to call it, now I've made an angle of deflection where my sword is going outside my body or pointed outside my body, and any blow that's struck at me I can deflect along that line outside my body. If I've straightened my sword dead on, well, I'm going to deflect that sword right into my torso. So what I want to make sure I'm doing is making this angle, but what that does is it actually points my sword off to the side, so that when I move forwards in a straight line, well, what's happening is my point is actually missing the target, and what I'm doing is now actually not deflecting my opponent's blade necessarily to the side, which is what I want to do. So ultimately what I want out of this engagement is that when I make this angle and I engage my opponent's blade, I want to lunge diagonally towards their sword. This will do two things. It causes more blade deflection to keep me safe, and two, it brings my point on line with where my target was. So when I do this against an opponent, you can see that as I engage with their blade, if they're inside my sword, this is where I'm going to turn my sword into that angled engagement, and I can move forwards at this angle and hit them safely. This works very similarly on the outside of my blade, where I would turn my hand palm down, fingernails down, second, as the Italians call secunda, right? And in this, again, I'm making that angle with my blade. My point's actually now pointed not directly at my opponent, but as I push forwards along the angle where their sword is, my point's going to come back in line. And this is really what I want to be thinking about when I go to address this against a static target without an opponent there to give me that feedback that I'm doing it right. I need to be thinking about these angles and practicing these angles when I work with my Pell. So instead of just addressing my Pell in kind of this static line and reaching for my targets, I can do all of those same things by thinking about which side I'm engaging their sword on and looking at my blade, engaging that blade by turning the hand, and then making that attack into their sword and watching my angle as I lunge so that I hit the target with my point, even though my hilt is not directly in front of the target and I'm lunging at an angle. Even if I'm not moving my foot, I should still be using my body lean into those angles as well. This is what's going to keep me safe as I engage my opponent's sword, so that when I turn my hand into one of those angles, let's say that inside line with the palm kind of up, I'm not just turning my arm and my hand, which is putting all of the pressure into my elbow. I'm actually turning my body a little bit and using the rotation of my hips to engage that line and strengthen everything and stabilize that, just like I would be if I were moving. But instead of actually moving, I'm just using my hips to form that angle. Angle, angle, angle. And this can also be addressed in your Pell use. So I hope you'll hit me up with any questions you have on this. To me, this is really fundamental to when we're practicing these angles, deflecting our opponent's sword, and thinking about these key elements as we train these actions. So have fun, stay safe, train well, and we'll see you soon.